Introduction. I am a manager within cyber risk at Deloitte. I have about 18 years of experience in physical and cyber and personnel security. Andrea, if you want to take a minute to introduce yourself, then we'll go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Dave. Yes, so in lieu of the international audience that we have on the line, good day, and thank you for joining us. I am Andrea Lestarge. I am a senior manager at Deloitte within our cyber risk, concentrating specifically on strategy and governance, and typically within the power and utilities or energy sector, as well as some of our state and federal government sectors. Very happy to be with you. I've got about 12 years of experience dealing in risk management, again, more from that operational and strategic perspective, and very excited to be sharing with you some of this best practice that we are able to apply in our daily lives. Dave, back to you.
Thank you. So, the bad news is that in 30-45 minutes, we will not be able to give you an expert fluency in the NIST Cyber Security Framework. But the good news is that we should be able to cover these two objectives. One is to introduce the Cyber Security Framework itself, which has three parts. The core, which we will spend the lion's share of our time in, the tiers, and the profile. We will cover them and you'll have an understanding at a high level of each of them by the end of this call. And as we go through them, we'll also be able to highlight specific categories and subcategories within the core that include cyber security activities, include physical security activities, and in some cases, are opportunities for convergence of physical and cyber security. To get into a bit more detail, we're going to start. I'll turn it over to Andrea on the next slide, and we'll kind of baseline terminology so we're all speaking the same language. We will talk about how the cybersecurity framework came to be. Again, we'll get into the components, the core, the tiers, and the profile. We'll talk about how to practically apply this framework, and then at the end we'll take questions. I'll turn it over to Andrea.
Thanks, Dave. So, team, we are up now on slide 4. If I can make any recommendation throughout this entire presentation, it would be that this slide is actually pretty darn important. From my experience and Dave's experience, especially in the topic of risk, because there is such that heightened awareness of, the issues that keep us up at night. Where do we place our time and money and people to decrease the amount of threats? There's so much buzzwords when it comes to this environment. And if we're not all speaking the same language, it can actually be pretty detrimental. One person's apple is not another person's apple. So we need to actually get down to the very brand of it. Is it a gala apple? All of that to be said, when we look at risk, that's actually a trifecta. It is a formula that is comprised of threat, vulnerability, and consequence. So if you are only looking at your threats when it comes to what is keeping you up at night, then you truly are just doing a threat assessment when you start to validate or not prioritize certain threats over the other. What we're going to encourage you to do is look at this Venn diagram, where if you picture a Venn diagram, if you're not online, you've got these 3 circles, and you have threat, vulnerability, consequence in each of those circles. Where they overlap is where you actually start to validate from the adversary's perspective what is the objective of the actual attack. So going through this, when we look at all of the various threats that could keep us up at night, we really need to prioritize what are those threats based on the actual weakest link that would allow that threat to be successful. When we look at threat and vulnerability combined through that lens, we're actually acknowledging what is the likelihood of the adversary's capability to carry out that attack. In doing that, you can, again, start to prioritize. Maybe the capability is less on this particular threat because we have these protective measures in place. On the other end of the spectrum, there may be a more prioritized threat because we know of the vulnerabilities or the weak links in that process, structure, asset, etc. Going around that Venn diagram, then we start talking about where does vulnerability and consequence or that impact actually occur. And where those two circles overlap is the likelihood of that impact. Again, if you don't have a vulnerability, the likelihood of a consequence decreases. If you do have a vulnerability, the likelihood of the impact will increase. Finally, completing the Venn diagram, if you look at threat and consequence and where they overlap, that's typically where we say this is the adversary's intent. No bad guy or bad girl is going to truly do an act that is so dangerous for them that it doesn't give them the greatest outcome. A lot of folks will actually concentrate on, if I am here to actually harm, how can I harm more people than just one? Or how can I harm more assets and steal more data information than just a few? So when we combine these three circles together in the Venn diagram, where they all intersect, right in the center of this Venn diagram, is truly the definition of risk. Risk is taking into account the various threats, how they are prioritized based on the fact that we do have vulnerabilities, and what would be the impact of that threat and vulnerability being exposed. When you look at all three of those, that is actually risk. Let's go to the next slide. So slide 5 helps us kind of tie this together, right? We've just described the importance of risk, the various elements, the functions that make up risk. And you're probably asking yourself, okay, so what? Well, when we look at critical infrastructure, the definition of risk truly is highlighted. If you actually look at that footnote, which maybe we shouldn't make it a footnote because it is such an important part of this, the U.S. Patriot Act, especially in the United States, I am going to get a little centric here for the country that I work in, but our Patriot Act says that critical infrastructure is the systems and assets, whether physical or virtual, that are so vital for this country to operate that the incapacity or destruction of those systems and assets would have a debilitating impact on security, national economy, national public health or safety, and really any combination thereof. So think in your own home countries, if it helps make the world go round, that asset or industry is considered a critical infrastructure. So now we need to look at it from the bad guys lens and say, our critical infrastructure, what threats can I actually deploy to do some damage? How can I deploy the largest threat to get the largest impact and devastating impact for the company, right? The most beneficial impact for the adversary. And the only way I can be successful in doing that is to actually exploit the vulnerability. Again, whether it's a physical or a cyber vulnerability. So the US government said, back in February 2013, we have to protect critical infrastructure. And in order to do that, we have to share information. So that doctrine, that call to action to start sharing information was written in Executive Order 13636. In May of 2017, 5 years later, a new president, President Trump, came in and said, I completely agree with Executive Order 13636, but sharing information is pretty generic, right? we need to actually guide people in how to share information and get down to that same terminology so that we don't have one person's apple being another person's different definition of an apple. So Executive Order 13800 said, yes, we are going to share information, but we are going to leverage the NIST CSF to do that. And what NIST CSF stands for is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It is a non-regulated federal entity that really develops unbiased sourcing of scientific data and practices. So this organization has created a cybersecurity framework that once again baselines terminology and has a consistent, defensible, repeatable methodology for how to look at risk in your cyber assets. The cool thing about NIST CSF is that it also acknowledges where do you have that physical piece. So how are you physically protecting your cyber assets? How are you physically protecting the penetration into those cyber assets? And then just looking at the cyber assets, what are we doing to protect them? So we'll actually now go to slide 6. Dave, I'll give you the mic, and you can go into the details of the cybersecurity framework.
Thanks. So, excuse me, one comment based on what Andrew was just saying. If for the global audience, if you're less aligned with the U.S. activity and thinking, well, you know, I usually operate in ISO 31000 or 27001 or whatever. I think what I would say to you is that, like those, NIST does not put out. These are voluntary adoption. In other words, these are not things that people have got to be compliant with. NIST will put out something, and then organizations or governments may decide, oh, yeah, okay, we're going to adopt that, but they just put it out. And I think the second thing I would say is that you'll see in the slides that are coming up that this is a bit more higher level and the entirety of the life cycle. So I think we have a lot of business continuity folks on the phone. You'll see that like the recovery stage is part of this, as is identifying assets and risks. So it's really the entire life cycle, as you'll see in future slides. Not necessarily an alternative. I wouldn't look at this as like, do I want to do this or do I want to do ISO 31000? That's not it at all. It's they should be complementary. So, with all that said, the CSF Cybersecurity Framework components, as mentioned before, are the core, the information tiers, and the profile. We'll get into them in more detail, but generally speaking, the core is kind of the what, right? So what are we looking at and what are we doing, right? The implementation tiers are a bit like a maturity model. So you would look at the implementation tiers and based on what you've seen and your analysis of the core, make a determination as to where your organization sits in various areas or in various ways. And then the profile is kind of a gap analysis and roadmap to get you to from where you are to where you want to be. So this is the core. The 5 functions of the core, it may seem, if you've never heard of NIST before, this may seem familiar to you, and now that you're looking at it, you'll probably see it in other places and recognize it. But these 5 functions we'll get into in more detail in the slides that follow. The functions are then broken into categories, and the categories are then broken into subcategories. The subcategories are the lowest level of detail in the core and the items that are closest to an action or a practice. So you would read a subcategory, we'll get into examples, but you would read a subcategory and say, okay, that's something that I either do or don't do. And that's where the tiers of the maturity model come in. The informative references are exactly what it sounds like. They're references to other standards or information that relate to those subcategories. So with that said, when we do this presentation in person, we have an activity where we have these questions written around the room, and we have people get up and use markers to write down their thoughts or answers to each question. And there's certainly no right or wrong answer, and I hesitate to even use the word answer. It might just be like, what are your thoughts when you read the question? Now, because we are not in person, I am not going to ask you to get up and walk around the room and write down answers. Instead, I would just say to look at these questions and kind of take them in for a moment. We will go through them one at a time. And the reason that we would ask these 5 questions is that each of them corresponds with one of the 5 functions in the core. So we'll refer to that as a challenge question. So in answering the question, and I don't want to steal Andrew's thunder here, I'll just say in answering the question, you are basically identifying items to look at within that particular function. So with that said, I will turn it back over to Andrea, and we'll have a little dialogue on each of these.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, please don't steal my thunder. So when we look at NIST, as Dave said, there's 5 functions, and the next few slides are going to help us kind of mock out an activity that helps us better understand each of those functions. The first function is identify. So in this function, we basically have to ask ourselves as risk management professionals, what processes or assets do I own that need protection? And maybe I even shouldn't say I own, right? Your organization, yes, it might be your branch or your division, but there's ways to always either, hone in on what it is that you specifically own, or have a partnership in owning because your division obviously reports to a larger enterprise-wide organization. Anyways, thinking about that challenge, what processes and assets do I partake in that need protection? And when you think about how would I answer that, you may start to say, well, I would want to protect my crown jewels. I would want to protect my most prized possessions. Some people may say I would want to protect my people, my processes, my technology, the secret sauce ingredients, right? All of that, if that's kind of what strums up in your mind, that would actually be an example of the category underneath the function of identify that is titled asset management. If you start thinking more about your processes, maybe you are thinking about your information sharing mechanisms, your information security in general, that might go to the category underneath the function of identify that is titled governance. You may even think, well, wow, I definitely know my assets, my people, technologies, processes, but what about the things that we are also very much dependent on that help make our world go round, such as supply chain management? So when we look at each of these functions, there is this, think of an inverted pyramid. There is this high level function. This one happens to be the first one, identity. But then there are categories underneath it that help us figure out what specific part of identity do we need to determine to protect our assets and our processes. Again, this can be in physical or cyber world. So to kind of sum up slide 10, the different categories within Identify are asset management, business environment, governance, risk assessment, risk management, and supply chain management. Dave, if you can go to the next slide. All right, so now we are on our second function in the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, and it happens to be protect. So I'm going to ask you a question and pause. What safeguards or countermeasures are available for you to deploy in order to protect those assets that you've identified in the first section? So again, you've identified what is important for you in the first function. Now you need to say to yourself, how do I proactively protect those things that I have identified? And how would you do that? Some of you may be thinking, I would absolutely lock it down, whether it is physical lock and key, whether it is badge access and card reader. Maybe some of you from a cyber perspective are thinking passwords, multi-factor authentication. All of those different examples would be the physical controls and the cyber controls that you would be assessing inside the category of access control. Another example may actually, if you're kind of in the lens of maybe HR or communications, you're thinking about your people. How would I implement safeguards for my people? And what we often get for that example is the second category underneath protect, awareness and training. Other categories within protect are data security, information protection processes and procedures, maintenance, that's a huge one. Think about your application security, and protection technology. Dave, let me pause. Is there anything from identify or protect, the first two functions that we've talked about, that you would like to add to?
Sure. If you recall a few slides back, we had talked about functions broken down into categories, broken down into subcategories. So when you answer a question, like when you answer the challenge question, which is an appropriate place to start in adopting this, right? What safeguards or countermeasures are available? You may say, well, we have a system where we manage logical access, right? We manage, excuse me, credentials for logical access. When you look at the core and the categories break down into subcategories, an example of a subcategory is that identities and credentials are managed, right? So you would look at that and you'd make a determination as to whether or not you do that. And not moving too far ahead here, but if you think about maturity model and gap analysis, and ultimately we're going to say, well, how well do we think the organization does that, and how well do we think it should, and then how do we get there, right? So, under awareness and training, an example is third parties understand roles and responsibilities. That's a subcategory. So, again, maybe I thought of that, maybe I didn't in answering the question, but the subcategory will take me down that road. On identify, I may say, okay, what processes and assets need protection? I may say, well, I want to protect my applications, my systems, right? And under asset management, one of the subcategories is that applications are inventoried. Right? I may or may not do that. I may do it well or not well. Processes may stump me, right? Like I may read that and think, well, what processes do I want to protect? I don't think I want to protect any processes. But then when I get under a business environment, one of the examples is that the organization understands its role in the supply chain. I'd say, oh, okay, yeah. So maybe we don't do that at all, or maybe that's very immature, so I would get to that later and then do the gap analysis and roadmap. Ready for the next slide?
I sure am. So team, we've talked about 2 out of the 5 functions. We've talked about identify and we've talked about protect. We're now moving into the 3rd function of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, and that is all about detection. The challenge question here, in order to answer how am I best detecting for those assets that I've identified and I'm trying to protect, and I say trying because it's a matter of when, not if, there is going to be some type of breach. The challenge question here is what techniques can identify cybersecurity, and let's even talk about physical security incidents. Because again, in this notion of our cyber assets, more times than not, are behind some type of physical barrier. And so, yes, we need to protect those cyber assets, but we also need to protect the perimeter of which it is that physical barrier. So what techniques can we deploy to identify incidents? In hearing that question, some answers may be, well, I need to continuously monitor. I need to monitor my network. I need to monitor my physical access. I need to monitor the flow of data. I need to monitor the flow of people. All of that would be considered the physical or cyber controls that you would assess when trying to determine how strong is your security continuous monitoring. That's one of the categories underneath detect. Another category underneath detect is the anomalies and events. Again, this is where you would be continuously monitoring in order to detect and analyze those blips that are not common. And we would also need to be looking at our detection processes. That's the 3rd category underneath detect. Dave, any comments here?
Just that this is probably starting to come together for some folks, but here we are in the third of 5, functions within the core, and we're at detection, meaning there is an incident, right? So the first 2 are pre-incident. Detecting is the incident occurring, and naturally the next 2 that follow will be post-incident. So you can see that we are really spanning the entire life cycle of from asset and risk identification to recovery to normal operations.
Yeah, Dave, that is such a critical comment, right? Is when we put all of these functions in order from left to right on a spectrum, and to Dave's point, a life cycle. So almost thinking about it as a clock where we go from 12 o'clock around. We do identify, we do protect. Detect is now at that critical moment where there is a blip. There is some type of event anomaly where we need to determine, are we under attack, or is this just some type of malfunctioning? Identify or protect, in which case we can combat that. So as we go to slide 13, now we are, unfortunately, which is going to be a situation that all of us will face at some time, that it is right of boom, right? We are now at respond. We've tried to identify all of our important assets. We have tried our darndest to protect them. We were doing due diligence to monitor them. We discovered something, and maybe it was too late. So now we need to respond to it. And what activities can contain or stop the bleed of those incidents? That's the challenge question that we're all faced when it comes to the function of respond. There are 5 categories underneath this function. Response planning, actually just having that plan and kind of trying to predict what would I do in situation A, B, or C. Just documenting that, having procedures, having points of contact to communicate with can be extremely beneficial when trying, again, to contain the impacts of an incident. You also need to think about communications. If you need to respond and the system either is going down, has already gone down, Or maybe it's the notion that it's a physical situation and you need to communicate out from what to do. These would be all examples of that category of communication. You also need to analyze. Every single part after right of boom is going to be, what did I miss? What did I not do? What failed in the protection section that missed the detection, and now I'm having to respond? That constant analysis is going to actually be a theme within respond in the next function. The other category, and two categories really between respond, is you need to mitigate. You need to figure out, are there any additional deployment mechanisms that you can put in to continue to try to stop that bleed? And then part of analysis too is that improvement. Now that I've hopefully stopped the bleed, what can I acknowledge from my analysis and improve on within our response plan, or maybe our detection system, or maybe our protection system, or maybe even how we identified our assets. Dave, let's go to slide 14. Here we're at the last function, the fifth of 5 functions, and it's recover. So this would almost be that bookend if we're putting all of these functions in a line, explaining the entire lifespan of a situation. Hopefully after respond, we have stopped the bleed, and now we need to get back to normal. So those challenge questions that we would have here are, what activities are required to restore capabilities? And said in another way, what activities are required to get us back to normal operations, to get us back to how we were before the event, and maybe even better before the event, because we have improved on whatever weak link we found out in that analysis piece of respond. So there are 3 categories underneath the function of recover. It is the recovery planning, very similar to response planning, but again, having procedures, processes, people to communicate with on how to recover. And it is also that improvements piece. Again, what did we miss that we should strengthen? And how do we communicate this all the way up the chain to our stakeholders? Or if we are stakeholders, how do we communicate this all the way down the chain so that literally boots in the field, people understand what needs to change from either a procedure perspective in order to have this not happen again? Dave, do you have any comments for the last response or recover functions that we've covered?
Just to echo what you said about planning. I mean, now that we're right of boom, as you put it, we have accepted that, yes, one day an incident will occur. And with that acceptance, what is the most important thing we can do? It's to plan, right? To know what we're going to do when it does happen. That would be respond. And then how we're going to get back to normal, as you put it, that would be recover.
Excellent. You know, Dave, while you're saying that, I also think of a crucial comment here as well, is the fantastic activities of exercising. And you can consider that part of protection, right? When we are doing our awareness and our training, if we can exercise in a safe learning environment, our assets, how we're protecting them, almost throw in an inject or a fake scenario that allows us to play out the oh crap moment, and then how our personnel and how we all within an organization or within our divisions respond to that, and how are you communicating that outwards, and how are you recovering? How quick were you able to recover? Where did you get stuck? You know, exercising all of those scenarios, number one, makes us a little bit more calmer, believe it or not, in an event, because it's almost at that point like muscle memory. And it also allows us to, in a safe environment, figure out where we are currently going wrong before we are actually caught going wrong by an adversary. So I think throughout this entire discussion of the cybersecurity framework, just to recap for everyone, there are 5 functions. Think of an inverted pyramid. Underneath each of those functions are specific categories. Going deeper into those categories, you can start to look at physical controls or cyber controls that all help you answer the challenge question of that particular function. If you're able to do that nicely, then you can be rest assured that you have a pretty good handle on this risk topic. If you struggle with trying to say, I have got controls for this category or that category, or maybe there's an entire function that is, kind of weak, that is where it would be a red flag for you. And Dave, I think you can take slide 15 and talk a little bit more about those tiers.
Certainly. So as we mentioned briefly earlier, the implementation tiers, this is the second of the third why do I keep saying that? The second of 3 components of the cybersecurity framework. The first is the core, which we just went over. The second, implementation tiers, as mentioned, is a bit of a maturity model of sorts to say, okay, these areas that I've looked at, where do I think my organization is? And where do I want it to be? So generally speaking, in these are 3, the rows are 3 very broad areas, and the columns are progressively more mature tiers for each of those areas. So you may do this as you're reading through it, you may do this for these 3 areas, and you may do it much more specifically for each of the functions, the categories, and the subcategories to put yourself on this maturity map, for lack of a better term. Once you've done that, it becomes a matter of, this slide here may be so internalized by some people that it's almost unconscious. And if it's not to that point, I would actually recommend trying to get to that point, because this is universally applicable. The concept of here's where I am currently, here's where I want to be, here are the gaps, and here's my roadmap for getting there. So you may do this and identify many things within the core that your organization is very good at. And wherever you are on whatever tier you're on, as far as maturity and capabilities, that's where you want to be. So there is no gap, and you need to take no action in your roadmap in order to make any change in that area. It's just a matter of maintaining what you have. There will be other areas where there are gaps of varying sizes between where you are and where you want to be. And in some kind of prioritized fashion, the actions that close those gaps would go into your roadmap for your organization. So this, when it comes to this cybersecurity framework, for many organizations, is the basis for the organization's entire security roadmap, whether it be 3-year or 5-year plan, what have you, is based on this analysis. I've identified gaps between where we are and where we want to be as an organization, and here's how we're going to get there. Andrea, anything to add on that?
I think that's exactly right, Dave. It's going to be crucial to look through all of these functions, identify really where you are, and again, looking at this almost as a 3D model. Where are you as just your own unit? Where are you from a maturity rating of where you share this information within a organization? And then where are you from sharing and environment where you can actually say from an industry perspective that this is how I rate or share this information amongst those partners. And again, if you're not rating it quickly or beneficially for you, then it's a notion of how do I get from A to B and what would be that plan, obviously hitting up this framework profile. So I think you hit the nail right on the head, Dave.
Thanks. With that said, this is our contact information. If you have questions or there's anything that we can do for you guys related to this cybersecurity framework or anything else for that matter, feel free to reach out to either one of us. I understand that this session is being recorded, so if you miss this slide, you can always go back and get this information in the future.
Okay, thank you, Andrea and David, for this very detailed and informative presentation. I would like to inform you that PCB provides training and certification services for risk management introduction, foundation, risk manager, lead risk manager, and also the transition course. A PCB certificate will exemplify your dedication in implementing and managing risk management processes and frameworks, and most importantly, you will be recognized worldwide. Now we'll go ahead and take some time to answer some of the questions regarding today's session. Actually, we had a lot of interest regarding the webinar. The first question is, what is the limit between the functions respond and recover? May recovering be a part of responding?
I can take that one. So I think it absolutely does gel. There is a natural connection between, okay, I'm responding, but isn't that intuitive to then recover from it? Because you're not going to respond in a bad way. So when you respond in a positive way, you are kind of branching over into recover. I think just to get very specific, NIST Cyber Security Framework does separate those actions out. But is there a a hard stop between respond and recover? Probably not. Where I would almost say, from a like a physical, maybe even cyber, it's you might be dealing with different audiences. So heaven forbid, if you've got an active shooter situation and you are responding to that, you may actually have first responders, law enforcement, firefighters, EMS, nursing folks on site helping those. And to recover from that active shooter incident, you actually would not use law enforcement. That would be a stakeholder group within your organization thinking about, how do we stop this attack from occurring? And you could definitely leverage law enforcement for their expertise, but they wouldn't necessarily own that. That is within your organization. Same thing from a cyber perspective. When you are responding to a breach and you are responding to an event that you are seeing on your network, you may actually have your analysts, whether they are certain levels. We in the United States call them level 1, level 2, level 3 analysts. But to recover from that may actually be more of your stakeholders, your chief information security officers, strategically figuring out, what do we need to do to get back to normal and not have this happen again?
Yeah, I think what I'd add to that, that's almost exactly what I was thinking as far as an answer. It's a little more plain in cybersecurity. If you think about a data breach, did you detect that somebody's got unauthorized access to your network, and your response is to shut it down, right? Like, get that person out, make it so that they can't access anything. Once you've done that, then you start looking at, well, what did they access? Where did they go? Did we lose any data? All of that kind of stuff. Response typically is security, and you mentioned law enforcement, and recovery is typically continuity from a responsibility perspective.
Thank you both. Another question is, it says, new definition of risk says it is the consequence of uncertainty of control objectives. This could be positive or negative, as it could present opportunities for improvement or have harmful consequences. How does this tie into the definition by NIST? Can the NIST definition be quantified?
Good questions. I'll take a brief stab and then I'll see if Andrea wants to add anything. As far as opportunities, right? So opportunity is often looked at as like a positive consequence of a risk, and that's a very valid point, and can be captured through this analysis as well. As far as definitions, you know, I go back to that baselining of terminology. There are a lot of different views and formulas, I put that in quotes, for determining and quantifying risk, and many of them are extraordinarily similar. Sometimes it's a matter of semantics, whether you call something like probability or likelihood, for example, and it's the same thing. And in other cases, there are some more material differences. I don't know that we're here necessarily to say that one is better than the other. The baseline of terminology in the beginning of this presentation is important, mainly for this presentation, so that everybody understands what we're talking about, the definitions that we are kind of operating from. As far as quantifying risk, you know, that's a similar kind of answer. Like yes, there are ways to do it, but there are many, and I'm not sure that we're necessarily saying that one is right or better. Andrea, any other comments?
I think that's right, Dave. So yes, there's absolutely definitions or formulas, and I'll be very US centric. You know, when we talk about quantifying the impact, we often turn to FEMA, who has a lot of structured documentation of what is a price point based on an attacked physical structure, an attacked amount of people, and maybe even going into a little bit of your, you know, your integrity from a brand perspective. So yes, we can use all of that, but it's not like that's, you know, the correct way. There's numerous ways. I think from my experience, what I would recommend is, regardless of which quantifying entity or formula you are using, just be sure to communicate that, whether it is in a presentation or if you are doing an actual assessment and writing up a report, just call it out, because then you are stating that assumption that in order to quantify, you know, again, consequence, I ended up using this resource or this source. And then you're at least baselining with your audience who's hearing this information, and you're not presuming that because you said it, they're understanding it. You're actually literally giving them the cliff notes or the footnotes after the report that says this is where it's coming from. So I'm hoping that makes sense. There's a numerous options out there. It's just a notion of whatever you pick, just be sure to blatantly state that to your audience so that we're all on the same page. And that's exactly, to Dave's point, what we did with this presentation is upfront we stated this is how we're defining risk.
Thank you both for that very detailed answer. Next question is, can you make a comparison between this framework and the ISO 31000 standards and also the ISMS, Information Security Management System? So what are the similarities and differences between them?
I can take that. So actually what we would actually say is they're one and the same. They help each other out. So when you are looking at all of your different ISOs, the NIST Cyber Security Framework actually points to those when you are trying to determine what are your physical and cyber controls. If you go back to, Dave, I think we have it. If you go back to slide 7, I don't know if you're still presenting, but for those of you on the phone, this is where we kind of set up the framework. You've got the functions, the categories, the subcategories, and then that last column is information references. And Dave, you just had it. There you go. So that information references, we literally are acknowledging that this is the specific section where NIST Cyber Security Framework will talk about different standards, guidelines, and practices. And this is actually where you would see all of those different ISO documents. So what they're saying is, use that language and help you, or use that language to help you fill out what are the answers to the categories and to these functions. Dave, maybe you can say it in different terms. I'm hoping that makes sense, but.
Oh, that was great.
It's okay. I didn't know if I had garbled my answer there.
No. I think the only thing I would add with regard to ISO 31000 is that, this is, it's the elusive difference between risk management and security management that we're dealing with here. This is a security framework, which is why it goes into detect, respond, and recover, right? The risk management piece of that, and 31000 will go into far greater detail about the earlier stages of this framework. So you'll see informative references, I'm sure, to 31000 under Identify and Protect. Protect is basically a synonym, at least semantically similar to mitigate, which is one of the risk management treatments that you can, right, you can also avoid risk or transfer risk, so on and so forth. But again, because this is a security framework, it's really only dealing with risk mitigation because everything else is kind of outside of that, right? So that was a long way of saying, in short, that I would say that they are complementary for sure, not different options, or not, certainly not redundant, but you wouldn't want to pick between this cyber security framework and ISO 31000. My recommendation would be to know and apply both.
Thank you. Actually, we have a lot of questions regarding today's session, but we have to apologize to the audience because due to the time limitation, we will only answer one more question. So the last question to conclude this session is the framework suitable for both small and medium enterprises?
Absolutely. Sorry to jump in there, Dave, but that's the beauty of this particular framework. Matter of fact, if that question is coming from an individual in the United States, I would also recommend looking at the latest version of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework that came out in April. They specifically pay attention in that version 1.1, the newest version, the one that came out April 16th, 2018. Authors specifically concentrate on those smaller entities. The formula does not change by any means, but it also helps us get more information references because some of the other references are just too much suiting to the larger entities. So short answer, absolutely. Long answer is you could actually get additional small agency information in that next version coming out, or the latest version coming out as of April.
Yeah, exactly right. There was some critique of the first version that it didn't seem, or it didn't even, it's not that it's not applicable to small and medium-sized businesses, but it didn't really address that. And then the latest version does. It addresses that, and I think the other big difference is a more deliberate inclusion of supply chain.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Andrea and David, again for this great session and also this great Q&A session. I would like also to thank the attendees for attending today's webinar. This webinar will be recorded and posted on our website as well as on our YouTube channel together with the slides of the presentation. You can get more information about this and other things related to PCB at our website, www.pcb.com. Also, please be informed that with this webinar, we conclude our webinar campaign for this year, 2018. I would like to once again thank all the loyal audience that followed us through the years with our webinars. We will see you in January 2019. Have a great day and enjoy your holidays.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Happy holidays.